Sonia Barbo, and I am going to be your presenter today. Dwayne is going to be running the slides for me because I need my notes, so I'm actually going to turn off my video when I do the presentation. Please use the Q&A for any questions. And Dwayne, we can go ahead and move to the code of conduct slide, please. And just getting your attention on the code of conduct, please, for the webinar. And again, any questions that you have, please put it in Q&A instead of using the chat option. I don't think the chat option is available, but Q&A, and some of my team members are here and they will answer any questions while we're doing the presentation. So welcome, and we're going to start because it is already 1:05. Okay, the next slide, please, Dwayne. So I'm Sonia Barbosa, and I am the Associate Director of Dataverse Support, Data Curation, and the Murray Archive, here with the Dataverse Project at the Institute for Quantitative Social Science. Next slide. So today we are going to be talking about intermediate data curation on a Dataverse-supported repository. The agenda is going to be start with a brief review of the fundamentals of data curation, which is basically everything that you should do before you start to share data. And the rest of the webinar is really going to be on the features and tools found on the Dataverse platform, and how those can be used to enhance curation of your collection space, your data sets, and your files. We have some use cases and examples to show you, and then we'll have time for questions. So for anybody who's new to Dataverse, please understand that this is an intermediate class, so we're not going to be starting with the basics of the Dataverse features and tools, but I think the slides are clear enough that you'll understand what we are talking about. Next slide, please. So review of fundamentals in data curation is where we are starting. Go ahead to the next slide, please, Dwayne. Okay, so we can't talk about data curation without talking about the importance of curation and the basic data curation principles. So why do we do curation to begin with? Well, in this time and period of data sharing, funders requesting that data be shared, and the fairness of data, findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability of data, it's important that the quality, organization, and overall management of your data are done and done well in order for others to make use of your data and for you to share your data according to the guidelines that others are requesting of you. So data curation is important for a number of reasons, right? It enhances the data quality. It allows efficient organization, which is going to help you a lot when it comes to actually getting to a repository and sharing your data. The way your data are organized, or the curation will allow advanced analysis of the data, more collaborative workflows, ethical compliance, and future-proofing data basically for reuse. Now we have some basic data curation principles that we talk about. Data identification, right? The types and sources of data that you're going to collect. Data collection is the gathering of the relevant and reliable data sources for your project. Data cleaning is referencing removing errors, inconsistencies, and duplicates in your data. Data organization is the structuring data for access and retrieval, right? So you have to organize your data well, not just for yourself, but for any of your collaborators to be able to access your data before sharing and after sharing, right? You have a folder system, and how should that look in order for other people to work with your data in your team, and then when you share that data for it to make sense to your users. Data storage is a secure, scalable storage solution. Remember that storage takes place not just when you put your data in a repository, but while you're also collecting and working on your data, depending on the type of data that you're collecting. Human subjects data needs to be properly stored for accessibility, privacy, and security by your team. And then in our repository system, data storage is provided by the repository that you're using. Metadata management we're talking about creating and managing descriptive information about the data. So metadata is always about the data, describing your data, where it was collected, the design, the sample, the analysis tools used, the replication environment used. Data preservation is ensuring the long-term access and usability of the curated data. And again, both happens before you share data and after sharing data. And then documentation and compliance and ethics is all about sharing while maintaining privacy and security, documenting the process, data transformations, methodologies used in what you've done to your data in your organization or curation of the data, and then adhering to legal, ethical, regulatory standards when handling data. The next slide, Dwayne. So when is the best time to document your curation or your data? At every stage. When you're discovering and planning your research project, you should be documenting your process. During the initial data collection, you should be documenting your process and making sure that your content is organized. When you're doing your final data preparations analysis, you should be documenting. When there's time to publish and share, you should be documenting, and any long-term management should also provide documentation of the data set. I've included an example here of a flexible framework for managing and analyzing complex data in biology. It's just an example of folder systems for managing a layout of your data on your end, right? You have the data space, you have the project, the experiment, the sample, the data set, and you have folders, well-labeled folder, detailed folders that you use to organize the information you're collecting about your study. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things we have to do before you share your data is assess the data quality and look into data cleaning techniques to prepare your data for sharing. So assessing the data quality, we are looking at things like data accuracy, data completeness, consistency, data validity, the timeliness of your data collection, the relevance, the usability, the duplication, and the privacy and security. So when you ask yourself about data accuracy, the correctness and reliability of your data are free from entry errors, and compared to the real world variable issues, your data are accurate. The variable that you're studying in the real world, your data are accurate. Data completeness, missing data have been checked and recoded, and my research model has been validated. When we talk about data consistency, the data display internal consistency, redundant data values are consistently identical, aggregated values align consistently. We talk about validity, the data conforms to definitions and rules of what you're collecting in the domain you're collecting that data. Timeliness, the data describes the real world event at the moment that it's happening. Some data can be out of date. Is another way to say the timeliness of your data collection. It doesn't apply any longer to the situation that's happening. Relevance, I have collected enough data to answer the research question. Do you need to collect more data in order to answer your research question or to meet the stakeholder requirements for what they're asking for? For usability, there are no significant hurdles to the usability or accessibility of the data that you are collecting. Duplication, the data have been checked for duplicate entries, duplicate copies of the same files in any unorganized locations. And of course, the privacy and security is that the data are organized and stored and shared in accordance with security and privacy requirements. Now, there are a lot of techniques for handling and assessing the quality of your data. You have to take care of missing values, detect outliers and correct them, normalization and standardization of data, deduplication of data, parsing and formatting, error correction, and handling inconsistencies. The next slide, please. So this was just a model that I found about data quality metrics that I thought was pretty easy, right? Looking at the completeness, the accuracy, the consistency, the validity, the timeliness, and the integrity of the data. It's another model. To me, I compare this, it compares very well to the life cycle model of data collection. But this is what you do at that part after kind of afterwards, where you're looking at, did I do everything I need to do? How were my data entered correctly? Were there mistakes in data entry? And let's go back and validate that my measures are actually collecting the information that it's supposed to collect. All right, next slide, please. I'm giving you 2 examples, and only 2 examples here on looking at your data. So in this first image, we have the employees' data. And as you can see, Paul has a couple of values. We have 2 ages for Paul, 1978 birthday, and we have a 1979. Well, which is it, right? That's something that you have to go back to your data and you actually need to correct. The other one we have, and I thought this was a really good example, mostly because we are getting a lot of image data and people are really wanting to share sensitive image data, which you can't share that in the Harvard Dataverse Repository. A lot of the examples are coming from the Harvard Dataverse Repository. You're not going to find any repository that's going to actually let you share sensitive data. The domain-specific repositories might, but in generalist repositories, they all want your data to be de-identified or anonymized. So in this first image, if you see it well, you can see some identifiable information about the patient. But in the second image, that information has been removed. The sex of the patient has been removed. And it looks like, because I'm trying to see my own image on this side, and some dates have been removed. So all image metadata is removed. All text burned into the image is obscured. And this configuration of de-identification useful for when you need only the image pixel data for further analysis, okay? So when you're sharing image files, it's really important to also take into consideration the information that you're providing in the metadata that may identify the patient. All right, next slide, please, Dwayne. And when you talk about data organization and we talk about the metadata and documentation, the taxonomies and ontologies become very important here. So taxonomies are helpful in organizing data, mostly in the organism, classification of organisms, and making it easy for navigation and retrieval of data. So there's an example there about biology, right? They talk about species taxonomy, kingdoms, phyla, classes, orders, and families. Ontologies enable the complex representation of knowledge. Okay, so in a medical field, you have a definition or an ontology for diabetes mellitus that combines the diagnosis of diabetes with diabetes-related complications and symptoms, drugs, labs, tests, and increasing basically the quality and accuracy of reporting on diabetes mellitus in data. And next slide, please. So here are again how animals are classified, just an example of taxonomy and an example of ontology, basic principles of biological ontologies that you should, if you have data that you are preparing for sharing and curating and organizing, you should start using when you start collecting your data or prepping for the collection of your data. All right, next slide. We are going to go into the curation and features and tools on the Dataverse platform, because this curation class is really about utilizing all of those features that you're probably not utilizing or underutilizing. And we have really great examples of collections and data sets that are using almost the maximum features that we have available. There's going to be some talk in here about APIs, but there is an API webinar in January, so I'm not going to go in depth into APIs here, but I'm going to show you them so you know that they're available, where they are, and that you can use them to do a lot of the work when you're sharing more complicated data. So what we're doing today is really not just about one data set. It's about several data sets in a collection and how you can enhance the fairness of that information. Next slide, Dwayne. So of course, we always talk about FAIR, right? Dataverse gives you the tools to move your data towards each principle, making data findable and discoverable with metadata, the persistent identifiers, connection to searchable resources. And that's one of the things there that we allow you to do, but a lot of people don't make use of the connections to searchable resources, accessibility, authentication if needed. Interoperability for analysis, storage, and processing is something that you should be taking advantage of if you want to do intermediate curation. And your data are going to be reusable because they are taking advantage of all of these additional features that are available for you. So a really quick review. Let's go to the next slide. these are the next 3 slides are just about the features in the Dataverse, and it's going to go by in like 30 seconds. Okay, so we have the Dataverse collections, what a Dataverse collection is, right? The next slide, please, is on the data sets and what that provides. So these are all completed deposits and what they look like if you enable the features that come with it. And then the next slide, please, is about the files, right? What's possible when you put a file into a Dataverse supported repository. But these also only work if you're using the proper file formats, if you are paying attention to what the file previewers that Dataverse offers, the file types that the file previewers support, if you're paying attention to what you can do with compressed files instead of uploading, 1,000 individual files. You could compress those files and use the zip previewer instead, and have a better organized collection of folders, and also having compressed files for multi-file data sets. And I'm talking about, data sets with quite a lot of files in them, thousands of files. It makes it easier for the system and for your user. But in order to know that, you would have to know that these features exist. Okay, let's go on to the next one. To the next slide, Dwayne. We're in review of basics in Dataverse curation. And I just want to make sure that's where we are. There we go. All right, review of basics in Dataverse curation, excuse me. So the best practices, and I'm going to base these practices on the Harvard Dataverse Repository because that is the self-curated repository. The other 107 installations around the world all manage, most of them do their curation management. But for our repository purposes, we're going to talk about the best practices in using a Harvard Dataverse repository. One, you want to request a collection, okay? You're going to deposit your data sets within the collection, and you're going to upload your files. When we say upload files, we mean data, code, documentation to your data sets. We do not mean article-only deposits. Those are not supported. And again, I'm not going back to give extensive definitions of these because this is an intermediate level class, okay? Next slide. So the best practices for collection. If you're really going to use the features of a collection, this is what you want to do. You want to ensure you have a collection name, an identifier because you get a URL that comes to your collection page. The category, are you a journal? Are you a research project? Are you a researcher? Are you an organization or an institution is really important. Here's one example of where category can be used incorrectly. You are an individual author and you are just submitting an article that you submitted to a journal, but that journal does not have a collection in the Harvard Dataverse repository. You do not categorize your deposit as a journal. You're not a journal. You're a researcher who is depositing a data set, and that journal does not happen to have a Dataverse collection, but maybe they recommend that you use Harvard Dataverse. So you are a journal. You are a researcher, not a journal. Journals use the category of journals. We actually have journals that have collection spaces for their authors, and they are categorized as journals. Collection level contact is really important, and you want a contact that works because when you have a whole collection of data sets in any repository, users are going to contact you about your data. They're not going to contact us. We don't know anything about your data. You are in a self-curated repository when you use the Harvard Dataverse repository, and we don't know anything about your data. We allow you to come in, deposit your collection. We expect that you're going to describe your collection well, describe your data sets well, but we don't know how you collected your data. Even if you provided us information, we would have to go into additional research about how you collected your data. So the collection level contact is important. There's also a data set level contact. Utilize the collection description for a number of reasons. In the Harvard Dataverse repository, we review your deposits post-publishing. So we actually go in and see if we can make sense of what you deposited, and basically that you're adhering to our deposit policies of no sensitive data. And a number of times we come across collections that have no descriptions. So it's very hard for us to make sense of what you're sharing. And it will be the same thing for your users. They might not have any idea what your collection contains if you don't utilize that description metadata block when you're collecting this. Metadata selection and custom metadata, we're going to show you good examples of this. Now, one thing about having a collection is you can have a collection, and if you don't actually go in and enable additional metadata, or contact us and say, I have some metadata that I'd like to capture, but it's not part of any standard, then you wouldn't know to make use of the additional metadata fields or the custom metadata blocks that we can create for you. But we have really good examples of intermediate curation using these features. Facet selection is also, to me, considered part of, you can go from basic to intermediate, depending on how well you use the facets, the searchable facets. And these are all sections that you have to enable and select when you are creating a collection in order to say you've done anything beyond basic curation and preparing your space for anything other than basic curation. All right, the next slide. In this slide, what we have is an example, and I just want to make sure my slide is aligning to what is being shared. Give me 1 second, please. Oops. Oh, here we go. Okay. So this slide here describes the methods, the APIs that you can use to create a collection. Now, as I mentioned, for the Harvard Dataverse Repository, collections are now moderated. So you actually have to contact us and we'll create the collection space for you, but then you go in and you edit the collection space with the details that describe your collection, okay? But typically this can be done through the native API. And up in the upper right-hand, left-hand corner, I have a brain genomics superstruct project example of the editing options that come when you have a collection. If you come and deposit a data set in the Harvard Dataverse Repository and you don't have a collection, you don't get the options for these additional settings, templates, guest books, featuring dataverses. You don't get to select additional metadata outside of the very brief citation metadata requirements that Harvard Dataverse has. So that's simple curation. You're not able to take advantage of additional metadata or searchable facets. So that means you're doing basic curation of your data. But with a collection, you do get to change the default settings for your space, and thus you're able to use more tools to enhance the findability, accessibility, and metadata support for your data. Next slide, please. Okay. So when you come into a Harvard Dataverse repository, and again, I have the brain genomics superstruct collection in the background of this image for you to see some of the information, the description, and the information that the depositor was able to put into his collection space to guide his users. But you have 3 boxes of information to complete when you come to a collection space. First, it's going to ask you, give me the name of your collection, give me an identifier that I can use when I create a URL for your collection. But most importantly, you have these metadata fields and these browse search facets. One of the settings that may not be noticeable to users is that there's a default setting that says use the metadata field from the Harvard Dataverse. But the only metadata field that's actually enabled for the Harvard Dataverse repository is the citation metadata. It's required and you can't get rid of it because it helps to build your citation. But better practice and intermediate practice would be that you select additional metadata blocks, such as geospatial, if you have geospatial data, social science and humanities, if you have that data, astronomy and astrophysics, if you have that data. Journals are expected, if they have a collection, that they'll utilize the journal metadata block. And then there's a computational workflow metadata. But that's not it, and that's not all, because here you don't actually see the custom metadata blocks, which I'll talk about in one of the other slides. But the browse search facets in a collection space are also important because it is using the default setting right now for the Harvard repository. And the Harvard repository only says, well, if you come in, we're going to let you search by or do basic search by subject, author name, author affiliation. In the main repository page, there's advanced searches. But in your collection, if you don't search or if you don't enable keywords or language or contributor name, in your collection spaces, those won't be easily searchable. So the browse search facets are going to pull from the information that you put in the metadata of your data sets and your files. And so if you select additional facets like keyword and topic classification and make them searchable, if you populate that information in your data sets, people are going to go to your collection page where you have, 500 data sets, and they're going to be able to narrow down their search because you've used those additional facets, you've used the additional metadata blocks that are available for your collection space. If you stick to just the what is enabled by default, which is the Harvard Dataverse settings, then you're not doing intermediate curation. You're doing basic curation, which is really going to provide you with your citation, which everybody has to fill out, but you don't get to capture the other information that's in your data. Setting up a collection is setting up the support for your data sets. This is the pre-work that you do to say, okay, I do have geospatial metadata in my data set. So when I enter my data set, I'm going to make sure this is enabled in my collection because it'll give me geospatial metadata fields that I can fill in for my data set. And remember, you've done a lot of this pre-work already by organizing your files way before sharing. Next slide, please. Now, this slide here is or includes the intermediate options for what you just looked at. The collection metadata and searchable facets. On the upper left-hand side, you will note the blue check boxes for additional metadata blocks being selected. One of the things you'll also notice in this image in the upper left is that there are some metadata blocks called PSI, DGAI, Alliance for Research, MRA. Those are called custom metadata blocks, and we're going to look at some examples of what those mean. So you've gone in and you've selected multiple metadata blocks because you look at the metadata blocks and you say, yes, I have geospatial data. Yes, I have life sciences, or yes, I'm a journal and I have journal metadata. Now, Alliance for Research and Corporate Sustainability on corporate sustainable metadata is one of the first blocks you see there. And Dwayne, you're navigating, so maybe you can put your cursor where that block is so people can see it on the screen. And they set up a custom metadata block. They contacted us and said, we need to capture some information in our data sets. So we want to set up these custom metadata blocks so that when our depositors come in, this is a group, when our authors come in to add their data, we can collect this information. The information they want to collect is not part of any standard metadata. It's definitely not part of the standard metadata that's available in any Dataverse-based repository. And so look at the questions that they ask for the Alliance for Corporate Sustainability. They added this, and every time a depositor comes in, they'll see these questions when they add a data set. It says, were any of these data sets purchased, obtained through licensed databases, or provided by an organization under a non-disclosure or other agreement? And the reason they ask that question is, if you do have licensed data or data that you purchased, when you deposit that data, you can't make those files available to other people. They have to go through the same process you did to obtain the data. Okay, so they're basically using their metadata block to do a check of what this person is depositing. In a collection, you can set the submit for review option so that your depositors can deposit, but they can't publish. So that's a workflow they're using here. But they're going to look at the answers that their depositors put for these questions to determine if the data were curated properly by the depositor. Did the depositor share licensed data or non-disclosure data or other agreement data? The other question they ask is, have you ensured that sharing the data does not violate the terms of the agreements if they did indeed have licensed data with their deposit? They also ask, do any of these data sets include individual level data? Because that has human subjects data sharing implications, and it also has implications for the Harvard repository because we do not support sensitive data. So they're using the metadata, custom metadata block to collect information about the deposit to determine if the deposit was curated accurately. Now, if we go over all the way to the right upper hand side, PSI is Population Services International. This is their custom metadata block. It looks very different from the one you just saw for Alliance for Research. And what they had in their data is they had a questionnaire that asked this information. There's no standard metadata block in the Harvard repository that asks for this information. So instead, they told us that they wanted to capture specifically this information that was in their questionnaire, and if they could create a custom metadata block to do so. So they're collecting information on behavior, donor, health area, intervention, population, products, study design, and study type. And they were able to do this because they contacted us to have this custom block created. And so if we look at the other two, there's a political science replication initiative metadata. They're asking, are the original data publicly available? Is the original code available? Again, this is a collection where the authors and the deposits are going to go through a submit for review. So they're asking all of these questions. The depositor is going to put this into the data set. They're going to see this block answer these questions. And then the political science replication administrator for that collection is going to see if that data set can be published or if it needs to be updated. The Murray Research Archive, which is the image you see at the bottom here, is we use terms from the Library of Congress to tag our data. And we don't want to just use keywords, which we can, but we prefer to use the Library of Congress. So we created, and because the Murray Research Archive collection has existed since 1976, we had some pre-existing terms that we wanted to maintain. And so we refer our metadata to the Library of Congress, and we created our block to capture some of these categories for our data. But as you can see, just utilizing additional metadata fields and then thinking about what's in your project and how to make some significant portion of your metadata available in these metadata fields that are searchable and that are viewable without somebody actually going into your data set, you can see how that could be important and would enhance the curation of your data. We are going to go to the next slide, please. So here's an example, right, of a really well-created collection. They utilized, and Dwayne, you can follow along with your pointer so people can see. This is IFPRI Dataverse. They utilized the collection level description with links to their websites, to their policies, to their open access and data management policies, to their terms. When you have a collection, the other thing you can do is you can create sub-collections. So we have sub-collections. They have a few sub-collections that they've been able to feature on their page. And those sub-collections, they go in and they do the same amount of additional metadata and additional searchable facets that they need for each of those sub-collections. So you're able to customize at each collection, at the parent collection and at the sub-collection. If you look at the image on the left-hand side of this same slide, all those searchable facets that are listed on the left-hand side of this image, they had to select those. They had to say they wanted to make funding agency something that's searchable. I don't have to go into the data set to see that they have the funding agency and funders listed in some of their data sets. But if I click on any of that, I can get to the data set of the funder that I'm looking for. Okay. They also use series name. So I don't have to go into the data set to find it, to know that it exists. And this is all part of intermediate curation, is making viewable prior to somebody actually getting into your data set, the information that you have available for your studies. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Now for the data sets, right? You've created your collection. and you created your collection with the metadata and the searchable facets based on the data sets that you're going to put into your collection space. So gather all your data and documentation to be shared. Know the license ahead of time. Ensure that your data are de-identified, because there are very few generalist repositories, if any at all, that will allow you to put identified data into their repositories. Most of them don't have encryption, so you're basically liable for what you share and causing harm to the subjects. All pre-sharing requirements have been fulfilled, right? So all of the data quality things that we talked about before. You've determined the metadata that's going to support your data set, and you've done that and taken that into account when you created your collection, okay? We're going to go ahead to the next slide on data sets. Again, there's an API for creating a data set, and there's an API for putting in files. So to create a data set and a Dataverse collection, especially if you have a lot of data. Again, this is not something I'm saying to use for a single data set deposit, but when you have a large project, and you're going to see a lot of examples of those here, the APIs are the way to go. The APIs for creating content and the APIs for uploading content are really useful in these cases. So if you are going to join the API webinar in January, you'll get more details about how to use these. Let's go to the next slide. So for data sets, everything that you did in the collection is to support your data set deposit, and everybody who's taking this class should be familiar with what a deposit template looks like. When you initially go to deposit a data set, you're going to run into this template, and at the bottom of the template, there's this file upload page. The first section you run to is that citation metadata. And as we've mentioned, that's required. You can't get rid of it. And some people build their collection and they never go back to add the additional metadata. So all they're seeing basically is the information to build a citation, but they're not seeing the rest of the information in the other metadata blocks because they didn't select them. And so we're going to talk about how to enhance and use the template and the file upload for better curation. Let's go to the next slide. So what I did in this example here is in creating my collection, I selected all of these additional metadata blocks to show up when I go deposit my data set. So I had my collection, select the metadata blocks, and then I went in and I said, let me deposit my data. This data set template preview, I went and created a template for myself. And a lot of collections do this when they have different people that are depositing data. Part of having a good collection is understanding what you want your depositors to put into the data sets that they're putting into your collection. And if you'll know, I have included custom instructions in that template about what the depositors should put in for title. In this one, it says, enter the title of your study or article as the dataset title. If I tell you how many times we come across citations where a data set is called dataset 1 or my dataset. Now imagine you're an author that publishes quite a bit, and even though you have a citation that has your first name in it, it has the repository, it has a DOI, it has a version number. All of your different data sets are called dataset 1 or dataset 1 or my dataset. How is someone really going to be able to distinguish easily which data set you're talking about? Your title should never be my data set or data for this project. It should be the complete title of the study. The other thing I highlighted here was the subtitle and other identifier. Does the data set exist anywhere else under a different title? Or does it have a different title that somebody should know about so they can make the connection? It's actually easier for you as the author to make the connection between a data set that you put in here now and an old title, because there are metadata fields that will allow you to do that. Other identifier. Does this study have a prior DOI or identifier? Persistent identifier. For example, the Murray Research Archive that I mentioned earlier. That archive has existed since 1976. before DOIs. And we have a number that identifies each project. So when you come to the Harvard Dataverse Repository, if you look at the data sets in the Murray archive, you're going to see the DOI, but you're also going to see the other identifier number, because those other identifier numbers are part of our analog materials, our paper data, our video data, that are not stored on the repository. And so we need to make that connection between the old PID and the new PID, okay? Point of contact, as I mentioned, people are going to be contacting you about your data set. So you need to have a valid email, because if they have a question and they can't get in touch with you, they're not going to use your data. Now, descriptions. As we review your deposits, as I mentioned, we review deposits post-publication. We have to determine what your data are about. So the best practice is that if you have an article or related project, is that you put the abstract of the article or publication as the description, because it tells the user a lot of information about what your data are about, right? Instead of just saying data for my project. And as reviewers, it also helps us to understand what you are sharing with others. So I've put in some, anyway, this is a good way for me to just demonstrate how to, if I'm working in a group especially, how I would set up my template so that my group knows the expected information that's supposed to go into this system. And of course, licensing in terms is part of creating a data set. So there, if you have a collection, you can set a license in this template that everybody will use, or you can allow them to use their own. Next slide, please. So I wanted to show you what some of the other metadata blocks. So I selected all those metadata blocks in the previous slide for my data set, and this is what they look like. So if you don't select it, you're not going to have these options just by using the default settings in the Harvard Dataverse Repository. You would never see these additional fields to populate for your data set. Next slide, please. So here is an example, again, of a data set that is really, it's well populated. They give you information on the contributors, on the language, related publications is there with the link. And Dwayne, you can follow again with your mouse, related publications is there. They're using keywords with links to the vocabulary for the keywords. Their descriptions have links in them. They have the date of collections, the series, they're giving you software information. And note that they're using multiple metadata blocks. They set up their collection to support multiple metadata blocks. And now they can populate that information. Next slide, please. Versioning is part of a data set. And in the Dataverse repository, versioning is done by the system. You go in and edit a data set, and it's going to create a version for you. For files, it's important that you understand the difference between replacing a file in a version and deleting a file. Because replacing a file actually leaves a version of the file. It leaves a log of the versions, whereas deleting a file leaves a version of a data set, but not that particular file that was acted upon. You won't get a version for that particular file that was acted upon, okay? And let's go to the next slide, please. Files. Files are important, right? Data sets and files are important. Collection is the base for supporting a lot of these, but data sets and files are really important because once you have set up your collection with the metadata, you need to put in the metadata. And then when you upload the files, well, you have to know what's possible for the files that you're uploading, right? Because oftentimes you are in a position to convert your file to a format that will work with the feature that we have in the repository to provide additional interoperability of your data, to enhance discoverability of your data. So best practices, right? Tabular files if possible, compressed files if you have a lot of files. Use the compressed folder support because it will allow better maneuvering on your data set page when you have a lot of files. It will also give you the preview feature that allows you to select which file you want to download. So I included links on the image on the left on this page to all the different file types that we support, so you can have that for a reference. Just remember, you need to know the license you're using for your files, especially if you have files with different license types. You could put that information about licensing in two places: the file level description as well as the licensing or the terms page. Remember that data have to be de-identified. Make sure our pre-sharing requirements have been fulfilled from the data quality checks we talked about. Make sure you describe your files. Don't just put up a file. And even if you have a README, put in a description for the file that you are putting in there. What's in that file that people are looking for, okay? And then know about the features that are available, because you could utilize one of these features and really just enhance the usefulness of your data on this system. Next page, please. So there's file level APIs to add a file to a data set. And there's also this API, that allows actions and crawlable views of files and folders in a data set and version, okay? There's more complex workflows for direct data file uploads, replace guidelines. And those come with some of the work that people do with uploading compressed files that have a lot of files within them, and they need to replace or fix a file. But you can start with the APIs when you have a lot of data that you need to manage on here. Next slide, please. Different upload options, okay, for your files. Know the different options so that you know what files we support and how to better support it, right? The DV uploader here, I have a link to the actual GitHub page. It's a command line bulk uploader for Dataverse that we've used for some of the projects that I'm going to highlight later, because the projects had so many files in them that you just didn't want to go through and put them individually into through the UI, okay? But Dataverse supports file uploads through its web interface, but there's a limit. The interface has a limit of 1,000 files per upload session. And you never want to upload, 1,000 files just displayed, just laid out linearly on the page. It displays uploaded files in a single long list. It becomes difficult for the user to use it. So there's a web interface support for zipping files is one way to simplify the process. I don't recommend you unzip 1,000 files on here. And this is why we have these large zip files and file zip previewers that will let the user see what's in your file. Next slide, please. So the file previewers are something you should know about and take advantage of, because what you have to do is say, well, if my file is in this format, maybe I can change it to this other format where I can actually use the previewer that's available to me, right? So taking advantage and understanding the different tools that the repository offers allows you to make use of them and improve the curation workflow for yourself and for your users, okay? Next slide, please. So to give you an example, here is the large, this is for large zip files, it's the zip previewer. It'll provide this type of folder support. It's a zip previewer that allows you to view the files within the zip, and then you select which one you want to download. So instead of coming in and putting in 1,000 files, if you use the zip previewer, I think this is the one. No, I apologize. This is, it looks just like the other one, but this is actually a folder upload. So apologies. This is our folder upload. The zip previewer is next. If I have a folder with organized content, I get two views. Dwayne can hover over the table and the tree view on the image on the left, and the image on the right as well. But the table view gives me, a listing of some of the files. I see each individual file, and I see the icons next to each file and what I can do with it. In that tree view, I actually get to see that it says there's a paper data, box 1 of 8. We have additional records for what these boxes are because they're from a data repository that we manage. And it tells me which PDF files are within that box. So when we have a user that's interested in this paper study that has 8 boxes of data, they can actually come in and preview and tell us which subject or name or information here they're interested in accessing. We don't necessarily have to give them access to every single file in here, but we can figure out which one they need and give them access to that. All right, the next one is the zip previewer. So apologies. Here's the zip previewer. And as you can see, it's one big zip file, but it has these different folders within it. And in the zip previewer, it works very differently. And I can go in and I can select which file in the zip I would like to download. Okay, so those are 2 different features, the folder preservation and then the zip previewer. Next slide, please. Now, for files, again, you're starting off with a blank slate, top left image of the file upload page. When you put in a file, some of the things you want to do, and I'm going to see if this will let me, no, it won't. So some of the things that you want to do is you're going to get a file name, you're going to get a file path. If there's a folder, your file path is preserved. If you use the folder hierarchy support, your file path is preserved. But there's a field for description. And then you see these options to add provenance and tags, restrict, add metadata, and add embargoes. Those are things you should take advantage of to enhance the information to make your file discoverable with a description, file level description. And tagging, if you tag your data sets well, your data files, not your data sets, each file. If you tag your files well, then you actually do end up with a pretty well discoverable data set and file at the file level. And this is one example, this edit tags that here that you see on the bottom of this image is one example of tagging that we did using scripts and APIs with scripts and uploaders. And we didn't do any of this through the UI. All of this was done using APIs. Because if you had to do this through the UI for this collection that has about close to 2,000 files, it would be never-ending work. But with the ability of scripting and using DV uploaders and APIs to make these calls and add this information, then you're able to do this in much less time and get the information that you need in there. Let's go to the next slide. So this SAFE collection is one of these collections that uses this extensive tagging. It was the tagging example that I gave you before, but look at the level of detail in the file. It wasn't just a file that was uploaded. There's actually 78,000 files, a little over 78,000 files in this entire data set. It's a project that came from the library. And I want you to note that all of this was done using APIs and scripting, Python. You'll find the link to those codes on GitHub and the SAFE collection on the Harvard Dataverse Repository. And it utilizes everything, file level descriptions, tagging, image previews, and it also utilizes a custom metadata block. Let's go to the next image of the same data set, Dwayne. We created a custom metadata block for this project called the SAFE metadata that collects records, creation date, person, organization, theme, and genre, because it was not part of the default metadata that we had. We utilized linking to external sources as well. So in the additional metadata, under citation metadata, there's an origin of historical resources, and we were able to put the links in there, again, using scripting and APIs to put the links in here and get all of these data files into these data sets, just running these scripts. Now, scripting is really complicated. You need a whole other class on it by itself, but this is the possibility that you get when you utilize the APIs and the additional features and the additional metadatas that are available. Can we go to the next couple of slides, please, Dwayne? The next one right here. So again, I've included the SAFE on GitHub. Just the next slide, Dwayne. Yep, I've included the link to the GitHub page for this collection, where it talks about the scripts the testing, the configurations, the data, the inventory. A lot of this work was done in the demo.dataverse.org for testing purposes before we started or finished up the scripts to bring the data from the library into this collection. Go down to the next slide, please. And just giving you an example of this script and what it looks like. So in this script right here is creating the Dataverse data file, set the metadata on the data file for file name, restrict categories, descriptions. We're looking at formatting. Joe, so just an example of just a small example of this data file script to bring this information in all together and all at once. And the last slide, Dwayne. So just to summarize everything, before data sharing, make sure you're exploring the cleaning, the validation options, ensuring consistency of your data, doing the normalization and transformation techniques to get your data ready for sharing. When sharing your data, especially if you have complicated data, you will end up using utilize the APIs for the many files deposits. You know, there are large data by size, and then there's large data because there's so many files in it, okay? You always want to select additional metadata blocks outside of the default block. If you find that you have metadata that would be useful for your users and they're not in any of the default metadata blocks that are available, then you contact us about designing a custom metadata block, because there's a whole consultation that goes into that process. Complete as many metadata fields as possible when you're depositing your data set to make it useful for your researcher. Keywords are really important. Descriptions are important. And then organize your files in supported formats. Look at the formats that get additional functionality in the repository with the preview tools, the archival functionality that supports interoperability and reuse, and make use of those features. So I'm going to stop here because it is 2 o'clock, but I will hang out for questions if there are any. I was hoping that we would have a little more time, but we didn't. But if there's any questions, please feel free to ask. I don't know if you can unmute yourselves, Dwayne. Are people allowed to unmute themselves on here?
No, I can. I'll give everybody the ability to talk.
And if you have any questions or any comments right now, it's fine. Remember that there's an API webinar in January that will cover more extensive techniques for bringing your data into a Dataverse-based repository and curating it for usability. But please, if you're able to unmute and ask a question, we are here to answer. Okay, if there are no questions, we appreciate your feedback later for this webinar. We appreciate your attendance, and please, your feedback helps us develop better trainings throughout the year. So thank you.